Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Rev Dr Rick Dacey, Senior Minister, Wesley Congregational Life.
So last week we began looking at the long, hard road to forgiveness. We looked at a number of sidetracks because we don't want to get sidetracked. The road is long enough to forgiveness. We don't want to get sidetracked, and we don't want to invest ourselves in something that isn't the genuine article, forgiveness. We looked at some of the things that forgiveness is not. We looked at the fact that forgiveness is not archiving. It's not putting things in storage that we can pull out later. What you did now and what you did a month ago and what you did a year ago and what you did 5 years ago, they all get pulled out on the table. That's not forgiveness. We also looked at the fact that forgiveness is not excuse. Excuse has its place it's the iron-on patch for the minor rips and tears in the social fabric. It's when we step on each other's toes. Excuse is helpful, but it's not forgiveness. And in fact, when we excuse someone, when we say, it's okay, it's all right, we cut them off and we cut ourselves off from forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is for when it's not all right. When it's not all right. Forgiveness is when we have to say, no, it's not all right, but you are all right. Yes, it does matter, but you matter more. And finally, we looked at the fact that forgiveness is not forgetting. That it's not about having amnesia. And when God forgives us, God doesn't forget what happened. It is remembering in a holy, holy new way. Remembering in a new way. As Jesus on the cross doesn't forget what's happened. He doesn't forget the criminal who's hanging next to him, who doesn't ask him, Jesus, forget me. He says, Jesus, remember me. To remember in a holy, holy new way. My body broken for you. Remember. My blood poured out for you. Remember. So we looked at that last week, and that brings us to our second part of this long, hard road to forgiveness. And I want to see how many of you have ever heard of this song, Amazing Grace? Anybody ever hear this song? A few of you have heard of that song. You've been around church a while, or you've been around anywhere within a 1,000-kilometer radius of a church, you've probably heard of Amazing Grace. And I would imagine that quite a few of you have heard the story behind Amazing Grace. It's one that's a beautiful story to tell. John Newton, the writer of Amazing Grace, was a slave trader. He captained ships that carried enslaved people as cargo from Africa to the Americas. Newton, you may know, if you know the story, Newton had a dramatic conversion experience in the midst of a storm on deck of the ship. And this dramatic conversion experience was a hinge point in his life. He became a Christian, and then an ordained minister, and ultimately he became a strong voice in the movement for the abolition of slavery. He became an abolitionist. Today, a hymn written by a slave trader turned minister is one of the anchor hymns in the hearts of African American Christians. You go into an African American church and you hear Amazing Grace, and it's like you've never heard it before. You hear it sung from the very depths of the soul. And this, a hymn written by a slave trader. It's a compelling story. The grace that grace could save a wretch like Captain Newton. And the one that it's a story that I imagine is going to be recounted many times this Sunday. As we look back 50 years and Americans celebrate 50 years, the 50-year anniversary of Martin Luther King's landmark civil rights speech, I Have a Dream, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I imagine in pulpits across America this Sunday, we'll hear that story recounted of John Newton and Amazing Grace. But you know, that's the abridged version of the story. That's the cleaned up, the tidied up, the simplified version of the story. The story that we usually hear in sermons is not the whole story. The whole story is actually a lot more complex, a lot messier. We hear that abridged version of Newton's grace story. And you know, it kind of makes it sound like his road to forgiveness was quick and easy. But the whole story is a lot more complex. For one thing, the abridged version glosses over the horrific nature of the slave trade that Captain Newton was engaged in. Years before his conversion, before Newton's conversion, John Wesley, you all have heard of John Wesley. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, after whom Wesley Mission is named. John Wesley wrote a daring and prophetic pamphlet denouncing the slave trade years before Newton's conversion. And when I say it was daring and prophetic, bear in mind that at this time, slavery, the slave trade, is very popular. It's an integral part of the economic system. Respectable people have an interest in preserving the slave trade as part of just the way the world works. So when John Wesley stood up and said no, it didn't make him a lot of friends. In fact, it made him some enemies. It lost him some church members. It got him in trouble. But that didn't matter to Wesley. Wesley spoke out, and he wrote this pamphlet, this bold and prophetic pamphlet. In his pamphlet, Wesley describes the way that hundreds of thousands of African American men and women and children were being violently dragged from their homes, chained and branded and jammed into stinking, hot, foul, disease-ridden ships, where they would lie chained together side by side for weeks. Sometimes they would be 16 inches allotted. There would be 16 inches allotted for each slave. More often, it was 12. In some cases, and when ships were very full, it was 9 inches, which meant that the men had to lie on their side on hard wooden boards for the weeks-long journey. Newton himself confessed that every morning on his slave ship, he would awaken to find the living and the dead fastened together. Normally, 20% of slaves could be expected to die in the passage. That was if all went well. oftentimes the mortality rate was much higher. And it is no wonder, Wesley writes, it is no wonder that so many should die in the passage, but rather that any survive it. And this is how John Newton, the slave trader, made his living. But he had a conversion experience. He had a conversion experience. He became a Christian. Yes, he did. He turned his life over to Christ. And he promptly gave up swearing and drinking and gambling. But he kept trading slaves for years. For Newton, the journey of grace was not a quick, easy trip. It was not an overnight, once and done. It was a long, hard road. Which raises a hard question. When exactly did God forgive John Newton? It's an important question for us in the 21st century because slavery is more rampant now in our 21st century world than it was in John Newton's time. When did God forgive John Newton? And we need to know because while all our stories are so very different, while we all come from very different places in life and have walked different journeys, we all need to be forgiven and to forgive. When did God forgive him? Well, was it during that storm when Newton cried out in fear, tried to make a deal with God? Was that when God forgave him? Was it right after that when Newton stopped swearing and drinking and gambling, when he became a polite, teetotaling, pious slave trader? Was it years later when he gave up the slave trade due to ill health? Or was it after that when he became an ordained minister? Did God forgive him then? Did God forgive him when with the teaching of other ministers, including John Wesley, Newton came to see the evil of the life that he had lived and to repent of his part in it? Was that when God forgave him? Was it when he preached his first great abolitionist sermon? Was it when he published his first great abolitionist pamphlet? Was that when God forgave him? Was it when he wrote his famous hymn? When did God forgive John Newton? Did God forgive him at some point? Did God forgive him at some point when he was really, really sorry? Did God forgive him at some point when he was really, 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 really sorry? Was there some point at which Newton felt sorry enough to balance the scales of justice? Is there some point in his life when he had done enough good to outweigh all the pain and anguish and suffering that he had caused? Is there some moment when God saw Newton's changed attitude and his changed actions and he said, that's all right. It's all right. No. No. John Newton can't possibly be sorry enough to make up for what he's done. He can't possibly do enough good, preach enough sermons, do enough good works to outweigh the pain and the misery and the suffering he's caused. No weight of noble good works can balance the scales. It's not all right. For God to forgive a wretched slave trader like Newton, it has to be a gift. To forgive him, God had to extend that hand of grace long before Newton could ever begin to earn forgiveness, before he became an abolitionist, before he wrote his famous hymn, before he became a minister, before he turned his life over to Christ. It took John Newton years to fully open to receiving that gift. But God's extended amazing grace to him. God extended amazing grace to him in all its fullness. In all his fullness. Before he stepped foot on a slave ship. Before he ever set foot on a slave ship, God extended that forgiveness, that grace to him in all its fullness. Ultimately, God didn't forgive the slave trader because the slave trader changed his life. The slave trader's life was changed because God forgave him. And that's a vital word for all of us. Because if God can forgive a slave trader, if God can make him a bearer of grace to the world, how much more so can God forgive us and make us bearers of grace? Newton's life was changed by God's forgiveness. How about yours? Is your life being changed today? There's someone in this room. I believe that there's someone in this room who is feeling tonight like you're beyond God's reach. Someone who's here is just carrying a burden of guilt and shame that you just can't lay down. And maybe you keep it hidden from everyone else. Maybe when you come to church, you try and keep it inside so that others won't see it. Maybe it's something that you don't even want to look at yourself. To that person, I have a message. To that person who's thinking tonight that they can't let the world see what's really inside, because if the world really saw what's inside, no one could love you. To that person, I have a message. The Lord knows. Nothing is hidden from him. The Lord knows you inside and out. Backwards and forwards, the Lord knows you better than you know yourself. Nothing is hidden. He knows even the dark corners of your soul that you're afraid to face yourself. He knows, and he loves you. He loves you beyond your capacity to imagine. He loves you. And he runs out to meet you where you are while you are still far off. He loves you. And there is grace enough for you tonight. And I believe that there's someone else in this room today, someone who knows that love. Maybe someone who's been in the church for a long time, but is struggling to forgive as we have been forgiven. I mean, you've been saved by grace. You proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, but somehow you've gotten trapped in resentment and pain, bitterness and anger. And no matter how hard you try, you just can't get yourself free. To that person, I say this: God's not finished with you yet. God's not finished with you yet. Look at the long, hard road the slave trader walked before he received that grace that was extended to him from the beginning. If God can reach the slave trader, God can reach you, to forgive you and to allow you to forgive. God's forgiveness can't be bought. It can't be earned. It can't be repaid. It is a free gift, but that doesn't mean that it's cheap. God in Christ walked a long, hard road to give you that gift of forgiveness. He walked the way of the cross. He died on the cross to save us from sin, from our sin, to save us from our sin and from others' sin, to save us from the sin committed against us. Genuine forgiveness is not cheap. It's a costly gift, freely given. My body broken for you. My blood poured out for you. Remember. It doesn't forget or erase the past, but it remembers in a holy, holy new way, in a way that restores our humanity and gives us a new future. And I say us because God's grace and healing and restoring forgiveness, that forgiveness at the heart of grace, is not reserved for slave traders. It's for all of us. It's for me. It's for you. When Jesus teaches us to pray our daily prayers, there it is: forgive us, and this is key, as we forgive. Now, what is Jesus calling us to pray? That God is compelled to forgive us because we forgive someone? God doesn't have a choice to forgive us because I forgave so-and-so. God, you have to forgive me. No. No, and is Jesus calling us to give an example to God so God can see how it's done? Of course not. No, this is a prayer of petition. This is a pleading prayer, asking God for the simple gifts that we need for the day. Forgiveness is one of those basic life necessity gifts, like daily bread. It's a gift that we're meant to share on a daily basis. God's forgiveness for ourselves is inextricably bound up with our forgiveness for others. Receiving forgiveness frees us to forgive. Receiving forgiveness empowers us to be bearers of grace. Now, last week, we looked at Matthew's account of this prayer, where Jesus amplifies our need to receive and to give forgiveness. And here in Luke's account, Jesus connects the prayer with a promise. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. Those who seek find, and to those who knock, the door will be opened. Have you ever thought of those words in terms of the forgiveness in the prayer? Forgiveness is not a heroic act for you to achieve. It's a grace gift for you to receive and to share this day. And that doesn't mean that forgiveness will be easy. It won't. In fact, it will probably be the hardest thing that any of us could ever do. Theologian Lewis Smedes said that forgiveness requires 3 basic actions. First, we surrender our right to get even. When we forgive, we place the outcome of the matter in God's hands. And we often choose to live with the scales unbalanced. Second, when we forgive, we rediscover the humanity of our wrongdoer. You know, when someone has really wronged us, when someone has deeply offended or betrayed or wounded us, oftentimes that person becomes the sin. We reduce them to that hurt, to that betrayal. They become the sin against us. And we know that we are walking that long, hard road to forgiveness when again we begin to see and to recognize, to rediscover their humanity, that they aren't the sin, that they are the frail, broken, fragile human being, much like ourselves. And finally, when we share that gift of forgiveness, we come to wish our wrongdoer well. We not only surrender our right to get even with that person, to bring that person down, but we desire good things. We desire for that person to be lifted up. We bless the one who persecutes us. And when we're able to do that, then we know that we have truly forgiven. Not settled for a phony imitation of forgiveness. That's a long, hard road. And at times we may be tempted to give up. We may be tempted to give up. We may want to settle for something quicker or easier or cheaper and give up on this whole idea, on this hope of a holy, holy new life. No, at times we might want to sidetrack. And maybe that's why Jesus has to ask us to receive and share the gift of forgiveness in our daily prayers.